So just so you see everything. All right. About the beat and the hip in San Francisco in the 50s and 60s, art of the 50s and 60s. So prior to the recent thing that has happened, the COVID thing, if we think about San Francisco, before everybody started moving out, we would say that San Francisco was in the middle of a boom time, the tech boom, that has transformed so much about the way we live, the way we're going to live in the future. But of course, as you know, this is only one of many booms in the Bay Area in San Francisco. The first one, of course, the biggest one was in 1849, went from that to that. And quick change, startling change to kind of reflect back where it was before. You know, the was when we first got here. And so today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a trip back in time, not too far back, but we're going to go back, not even here. We're going to go all the way back to the 1950s, the post-war years. Now, despite the arrival of thousands of people in San Francisco, Rosie the Riveters and others, who made the Bay Area the shipbuilding capital of the world during the war, San Francisco was small in the 1950s, provincial in many ways, charming perhaps, but certainly not an art capital. It was not New York. But nevertheless, San Francisco produced a wide range of powerful art as artists both created their own variations on the style of abstract expressionism that came out of New York, and they went off on tangents unknown to the New York sophisticates who, then as now, largely ignore West Coast culture. So I'm going to introduce you to a crowd of fascinating artists. I'm sure many of them will be familiar to you, but others not so much. And these are great people to know because when we can go back in museums, you can see these artists' works in our local museums. They're interesting people who responded to Northern California's creative freedom in wonderful ways. So let's start by comparing New York and San Francisco in the 1950s. And I do want to remind people to mute yourself because cats come through the rooms and all kinds of little noises, radios and so forth. Okay, thank you. So New York in the 1950s, of course, is much bigger. It's way more sophisticated, and there's lots of Europeans, starting with the war and post-war, there's lots of Europeans, European artists, European collectors with their Louis Vuitton luggage and so forth. And New York has a very active gallery scene. This, for example, is Peggy Guggenheim's Art of This Century gallery with a surrealist exhibit going on in there. And the artists there are asking how they can push painting forward, how they can give themselves an identity. And so these are artists like Mark Rothko, who claimed to paint only the most basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, as he said, or artists like Franz Klein, or of course, artists like Jackson Pollock. That's New York. Now, San Francisco, of course, is smaller, and artists have much less opportunity to see European and even East Coast art. In fact, magazine photos convinced local artists that Willem de Kooning, for example, used very thick paint the way they did in San Francisco. And in fact, his paint is quite thin, but they didn't see it in person. They saw it reproduced in a magazine. So artists had much less opportunity to sell to this public. We see here in San Francisco. I wonder if you'll recognize where this is. It's Maiden Lane, home at the time of the House of Pets and so forth. So there were not very many happening art galleries in San Francisco. People bought art at Gump's. Gump's actually started out as an art gallery. And I love how they have bargain tables. I wonder what we might have gotten on a bargain table at the time. But San Francisco did have museums. So the De Young was in operation since 1895. The Legion of Honor started in 1924. And of course, SF MoMA was one of the country's first museums dedicated to contemporary art. And it opened its doors in 1935. In 1939, SF MoMA had Guernica, Picasso's Guernica exhibited. And Jackson Pollock's first solo museum exhibit was at SF MoMA in 1945. So without galleries, what did San Francisco have? How did artists get together and learn from each other? That was in art school. So particularly SFAI, at the time as the California School of Fine Arts, was a decisive force in the post-war period. Here's a picture of it by a faculty member, a certain Ansel Adams. Yes, he taught there. So art schools exploded in the post-war years when 70 to 80% of the students were on the GI Bill. Those returning from the war were not interested in practical skills. Congress even voted down a provision to restrict the GI Bill to sort of practical job training. That's hard to believe. They were interested in the humanities, in literature, and in art, particularly modern art. Here we are at the Art Institute, and the gentleman in the front is channeling Magritte there. That's good. So the director at the Art Institute actually put a curtain over their wonderful Diego Rivera mural to indicate that the world had changed and there's a lot of excitement happening there in the post-war years and a lot of fun. So the artists in this picture, this jazz band, we can see David Park on the piano, Elmer Bischoff on trumpet, and Wally Hedrick is in there on a banjo somewhere. So the artists were hanging out, working, partying, and developing in a college rather than a market environment, which does not mean to say that colleges cannot be cutthroat and competitive places. They are, but it's different than the market environment for these artists. And of course, it was the era of the beat poets. Even Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac migrated from New York to San Francisco, where the vibe was definitely more Zen than existential. So with that background, the post-war art story really begins with Clifford Still, who arrived at the Art Institute as an instructor in 1946. He is really one of the first artists, even in New York, to move fully into abstraction. So by 1941, he had given up all figuration in his art. And as you can see in this picture, he made works entirely from lines and colors with no figurative illusions at all. And he stayed with this style without major departures from the 40s until his death in 1980. Here we see him with Mark Rothko, who also taught for a summer session at the Art Institute. There they are, looking like a couple of really radical artists. Kind of interesting. They look like insurance salesmen or something. But Still was a powerful influence on students and colleagues, and he set out to train an entire generation that painting meant passion, individuality, freedom from rules, basically abstraction. So works like this of his, which is huge. So this is a garage door sized artwork, over 9 by 12 feet actually, has this raw kind of unfinished look, using lots of color, lots of light, and these jagged forms that really remind lots of people of geological elements, canyons, even bark, something like that. He was from North Dakota. He was from the Pacific Northwest. And so imagery from the natural world seems to be behind a lot of what he's doing. There's another work of his, these edges that he has. My husband gave me a mug. He visited the Clifford Still Museum in Denver, and he brought me a mug with a quote from Still that says, "It's just awful to be stopped by the canvas's edge." He looks to go big. There's another work of his, so you can see how he operates here. Under Still's influence, abstract expressionism, if we can call it, swept through the Art Institute. Although, as one former student put it, the longer you studied with Still, the less like his work yours became, which is interesting. It means to me that he was probably actually a good teacher. So I want to look at some of the Bay Area painters who expressed Still's passion for abstraction in their own ways. And the best known, of course, is Richard Diebenkorn. So Diebenkorn moved to San Francisco as a young boy. He attended Lowell High. He went to Stanford, where he became enamored of the works of Matisse, Henri Matisse, which he saw at the Palo Alto home of Sarah and Michael Stein. Many of the important Matisses at SF MoMA actually come from them. So here's a couple of early works of Diebenkorn. It'll probably surprise you. We're not used to thinking of him doing this style of work. These are untitled works from the late 40s on this one here. They use the oxblood reds that were prevalent in San Francisco abstraction of this time. Now, the one on the right is kind of cool. And if I tell you that he was living in Sausalito at the time, you might begin to see some image in there of the tunnel. So Diebenkorn is one of the famous ones. Many people feel that there's no such thing as complete abstraction because the eye is always creating a figure in it somewhere. And Diebenkorn himself always said that abstraction was difficult because landscape was always kind of being pulled into it. And that's kind of a cool example of it. So Diebenkorn was at the Art Institute. He did stints in graduate school at Albuquerque and at Urbana, Illinois, University of Illinois, where he did this, which is incredibly titled Beach Town. He was madly uninspired by the Midwestern landscape and was still thinking about California, I guess, in his mind. But now at this point, we begin to see his typical colors, which have more in common with Matisse, these beautiful pastels and the Diebenkorn green. And his style loosens up. He allows what are called pentimenti, which is slip-ups, things you might want to change. So we have a much looser kind of style. And this work on the right is one of his Berkeley series that is called Berkeley with a number. This one's 53. So Diebenkorn, a really important figure, as you know, in Bay Area art, and he's going to come back later. So the other probably most important abstractionist of this period is Sam Francis, who's also was a native of San Mateo. And he studied psychology actually at UC Berkeley, although Clifford still recalls seeing him hanging around at the Art Institute. He took up painting actually while recovering from a spinal injury that he sustained in the Army. And he eventually created large works of luminous color and ragged shape that do sort of hint at Still's style, like this one is called Big Red from 1953. In 1950, he took off for Paris, and he lived there and in Japan until settling in Santa Monica in the early 60s. And in Paris, he was celebrated as a representative of an École du Pacifique, which the clever French critics saw as an alternative to the work being done in New York. Time magazine called him the hottest painter in Paris. Like Diebenkorn, he was an ardent admirer of Matisse, like who would not be if you're an artist, and he produced beautiful, colorful abstractions, often dominated by the color blue, like this one, or his Blue Balls series from the early 60s. And eventually we see him moving into an interesting period in which he combines freely thrown splotches and dripped stuff with a grid structure underneath it, like this work, which is at SF MoMA. And he continues changing his style, becoming looser configurations, web-like, all through his life. He died in 1994, but he's one of the artists who really stayed with abstraction throughout his whole career. He's a great artist. So we find other accomplished abstractionists at the period at SFAI in the late 40s. And so the first one I want to talk about is Frank Lobdell. There he is. It's Artists in Ties. It's rather interesting. Now, Lobdell's works, in the words of critic Thomas Albright, are somber, dramatic, agonized, and grave. So he does sound like an existential abstract expressionist in a lot of ways. And here's a work of his and another that, as you can see, have a bit of Clifford Still-ism in them. But he's using not figures exactly, but things that suggest shapes that suggest associations of some sort. And this actually, I showed this a couple of seconds ago. This is a work of Clyfford Still's. And in these two, I think you can see a real similarity going on. Now, rather than the energy and action of much abstract expressionism, Lobdell's works seem weighty, the result sometimes of hard work and difficult art choices. Now, this is an interesting work where, once again, I think you can see that is it abstract? Is it figurative? I'd say it's abstract, but certainly that figure at the top that looks like either a frog or a snake, other things going on in here. And the red in the center at the bottom there, I can't help but associate that with a swastika, because Lobdell was in an army group that liberated concentration camps during the war. So I see barbed wire and all sorts of heavy associations in this work that may or may not be there. It's just called Painting 427, and it was done in 4/27/92. And this other work of his called Summer, also they're kind of heavy, deliberate works. He had for a long time, and in later works he does let in more light and air, though he's still hovering between abstraction and figuration. In other words, using shapes that suggest associations for us. And he died in 2013. And another of the abstractionists, Hassel Smith, takes us in a sort of different direction that's typical of a very San Francisco kind of attitude that never seems to be suppressed. And his works are active and sometimes have an almost comical quality to them, including pictographs that are almost cartoonish. And again, like Lobdell, his shapes suggest associations, and their titles reinforce that. So this one is called Alone with the Killer. Here's one beautiful colored work called The Triumph of Gargoyleism. And of course, To the Moon from 1961, that really is very energetic, colorful. And 1961, it's a time, I guess, when people were going to the moon, thinking about going to the moon, which also reminds me of the honeymooners, right? Didn't he always say, pow, off to the moon? I don't know if that's what this is talking about. So this is Smith. He moved through a period of geometrical works like this, like how different in the 70s, what he called his measured period. By the end, he returns to a celebration of color, movement, and just real painterliness in this later work of his. And he died in 2007, but he's another one who stayed with abstraction the whole time. So I want to finish out the abstractionist part of the presentation by looking at two probably lesser known artists to you, and not coincidentally, they're both women. And the first is Sonia Getchoff, who lived in San Francisco for most of the 50s and was an active participant in the local art scene, widely appreciated, widely exhibited, along with the men, who apparently accepted women painters a little more readily than their New York counterparts did. The New York school was a fiercely macho place. Getchoff cites the works of Clyfford Still as a major influence, especially during her shift from figuration to abstraction. Here's one of her early works called The Chase. She was one of the first to work with a palette knife rather than a brush, and she produced energetic works, often with a vortex of marks of nuanced color. There's a work of hers that's at Oakland called Etya. It's named after her mother. Getchoff and her husband, Jim Kelly, lived in the famous Fillmore Street apartment house called Painterland, along with a revolving cast of artists, musicians, and poets, including both Joan Brown and her husband, Jay DeFeo and her husband. A lot of people lived there and influenced each other. So in a work like this one called Painting 4, which is also done with a palette knife, you can see a lot of similarity to Jay DeFeo's work called The Rose, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And in fact, Getchoff may have been the inspiration for Jay using a palette knife in her works. And I want to use this and show you what looks like close up. Really made quite large. MoMA. You can certainly see the similarities there. So Getchoff and her husband, Jim Kelly, left New York for San Francisco in 1958. And though her work fell out of fashion, it continued to evolve until her death just last year, 2018, at age 91. So then we'll move to look at the works of Bernice Bing, a woman, an Asian woman, and a lesbian woman, who was very, very involved, like Getchoff, as a participant in the local art scene, which seems to have been kinder to her in a way than history has been. There was an exhibit of her works at the museum in Santa Rosa, the Sonoma Art Gallery, a year or two ago, but they're hard to find, right? So she was born in China in 1930s. She was orphaned very young, and she lived in orphanages with white foster families and sometimes with her strict Chinese grandmother. She struggled academically, but she excelled at art, and she's a graduate of Oakland Technical High School. And she attended CCAC and the Art Institute, where she studied with Clifford Still. She also studied with, who do you think? Who does this remind you of? Richard Diebenkorn. She studied with Nathan Olvera and with Saburo Hasegawa, who interested her in Zen calligraphy as well as Taoism and Buddhist philosophy, and ignited in Bing a lifelong devotion to spirituality. That said, she was also fully engaged in the lively beat culture and movement of the time. In fact, her studio was above the old spaghetti factory pictured here in North Beach. If you look carefully, you might see yourself in the background there. That would be cool. This was a favored beatnik hangout. She held her own as a hard drinking dancer at the Painterland complex. Jay DeFeo called her a fiery presence. Now, her first solo exhibition was at the Batman Gallery, and it featured this work, which is from a series of paintings based on Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, 17th century painting, which I'm sure you remember is this very complex, famous art historical work in which you see not only a reflection of the people looking at the painting, not only somebody going out the door, but the artist himself on the left. And we can see some kind of figure in the background here. We also have the easel in the front that's similar. So she did a series of works based on the 17th century work. She worked in a range of jobs throughout her life, from vineyard caretaker to community art coordinator, though she continued painting. There's a lovely work called Maya Kamas, and another one called Anderson Valley, and she died in 1998. So at this point, you may be saying to yourself, where is all this abstraction coming from? Because after all, as the story is told of San Francisco in the 1950s, it's dominated by one of the probably really only original art style to come out of Northern California, and that's the Bay Area figurative movement. Now, this movement was born when our next artist here, David Park, took all his abstract paintings down to the Berkeley dump in 1949 and decided to return to painting the human figure. And that's because, as he said, art ought to be troublesome. And to him, the human image was an endless source of trouble. So basically, he went from this in 1948, right? Typical San Francisco reddish abstract work, to this done bicycles. Later, his friend said, "Oh my God, what happened to David?" And pretty much everybody else wondered that too. So Park was from Boston originally, but he ended up in the Bay Area studying at UC Berkeley in the late 20s. He worked as an assistant to the sculptor Ralph Stackpole, who was creating plaster casts for the Park helped him creating the cast for the sculptures on the new Stock Exchange building. And in 1930, actually, he met Frida and Diego, who stayed in Stackpole's studio during their visit that year. Park did a few WPA murals and experimented with, a Picasso-esque type style. But he began teaching at the Art Institute in 1944, and he was soon under the sway of abstraction. And he said that the ideals of abstract expressionism, vitality, energy, profundity, warmth, they were his goals too, but his abstract works almost never achieved his aims, according to him. So he fell off the abstract wagon and took a load of talented artists with him. So his earliest figurative works, made in the first half of the 50s, are characterized by thick paint and rough handling, same as an abstract expressionist hand, we could say. But they introduce figures, generally ordinary people doing ordinary things, as we see here in this work called Dancers. We'll often find a cluster of figures in the center, as in this one, made of shapes that fit together almost like puzzle pieces. You can see here in Dancers. He also not only just introduces the figure into painting, but he gets to play with things that are not part of abstract work, such as perspective and foreshortening. So we often have a very large figure, maybe just a head, as in this case, with small figures in the background. And not only do we have that, but we have something that's absent from an abstract painting, and that is a defined light source. So you can see the white on the woman's face and neck, and it's also causing the shadow, light's also causing the shadow of the figure in the back, right? He also generally likes to include a strong diagonal leading back into the picture plane, as he does here. The backgrounds are sometimes without horizon or a sense of actual place. And he manages extraordinarily economical faces, like this portrait of his friend Richard Diebenkorn, or this later one, which shows us how, as the decade progressed, Park's figures became less and less defined. Backgrounds and any sense of specificity seemed to melt away. And in a sense, he seems to be going back towards abstraction, right? And let's look at some of his later works. You like that one, huh? This one, this is just called red figure head, but I think it's a self-portrait that seems to have a lot of what Park looked like in it. But as you can see, the figures are getting looser. He was very interested in swimming and water in his background. This one is called Eve, naked woman with tree. And by the time you get here, yes, there's figures in there, but it's very, very loose and wild. In the last year of his life, which was 1960, Park was too ill to work at an easel, so his final works were actually done in bed, and they're smaller in format, in gouache, in crayon, and in ink, and so forth. And if anything, they're even more abstract than his last works in oil. And finally, though, frustrated with the small format, he asked his wife to find something larger, and she provided a 30-foot long roll of kitchen shelf paper, which he drew on with felt tip markers, which themselves were new at the time. So this incredible scroll contains scenes from daily life, from Park's life. There are images of identifiable places like the Boston Common and UC Berkeley, Sproul Plaza, and it ends with this haunting image. So Park was just 50 when he got cancer in 1960. Rather sad. So, well, once we get into the era of Bay Area figuration, that's when Richard Diebenkorn comes sailing back into view. He is doubtless the best known Bay Area artist nationally and even internationally, and he produced masterful works, both in abstraction in his early career, and in figuration, always in his characteristic NorCal colors. So Diebenkorn said that his epiphany came while flying in an airplane and seeing the landscape from above, which gave him a sort of structure for his works. And in fact, whether they're abstract or figurative, his canvases are often defined by geometric planes. For about a dozen years, beginning in 1955, he concentrated on figurative subjects, but he didn't restrict himself to the human figure as Park did. He, besides portraits, often of his wife, he did still lifes, landscapes, and views, such as this one called Chabot Valley of 1955. This was apparently a very important painting to him, and he kept it in his studio for until he died, I believe. Now, despite his interest in landscape, Diebenkorn rarely painted outdoors. In these two works, this is Cityscape from 1963 or Seawall from 57, a few years earlier, we can see the order and elegance that really characterizes Diebenkorn's mature landscape views, whether they're pure studies like these, or sometimes his landscapes are a background to portraits or glimpses through an open window, which is a favorite compositional device of his. Now, although this is simplified into blocks of color, Seawall does suggest the essentials of the Northern California coastline. And in fact, if we look back at this one, at Cityscape, it's interesting that if you divide this painting vertically and say, put your hand over the right side, you'll see the left side looks like a cityscape, a street with blocky houses on it. But if you do the opposite and focus on the right side, if you cut the painting, for instance, cropped it down, it could easily just be an abstract composition. And in fact, very similar to his later Ocean Park works. And we were here. So here's a couple with women in them. He liked to include women in his paintings, doing pretty much ordinary things. But he goes out of his way to avoid sentimentality, to avoid a story in them. And he does this primarily by simplifying the face so that we don't get a sense of personality as you would in an older type of painting, a master painting. The face is really there, the figure is there as a compositional element, not really as anything else. By the way, here's A Woman with Coffee Pot by David Park. Now, if you look at these, you never will run any danger whatsoever of confusing the work of Diebenkorn and David Park. They're quite different. So here's some more landscapes, kind of a landscape of Diebenkorn, women on the porch at the Oakland Museum. There's wonderful colors. And this one, interior with doorway. So you can see how he likes to use windows to structure his works. This was a painting of his studio in Berkeley, which is where the Ashby BART station is now. Interesting. And of course, you know that later in his career, in the late 70s, going into the 80s, oh, I'm sorry, forgot that. Here's a couple of sketches. Here's a quiz for you. A couple of sketches. Which one is by Park and which one is by Diebenkorn? Of course, the Diebenkorn's on the right. You can always recognize that. And that's where I was going. Later in his career, Diebenkorn moved to Los Angeles. He taught at UCLA, and he lived in an area of Santa Monica called Ocean Park, and he went back to abstraction in these incredible series of works just with this astonishing luminous color. But some of this structure you can see all the way back even to Beach Scene that he did in Illinois. He's organizing a canvas geometrically. It's really quite interesting. So he's our biggest guy, but we have a lot of other powerhouse figurative painters to look at. The first one is Nathan Olvera. There he is. Local-born, Oakland-born artist, graduated from San Francisco's George Washington High School. And I don't know, I didn't figure it out, but he might have been there when those murals were actually being painted. He attended CCAC, and he taught art in lots of different colleges, including there and at the Art Institute, of course. And for 32 years, he taught at Stanford. Now, you may have to stretch your imagination to consider a work like this as a figurative work. these figure is there, but barely just in an isolated, painted in an improvisational style. And his works in some ways seem to have more in common with someone like Willem de Kooning here. In this one, I think you can see the similarity. So there's human isolation, a sense of conflict, somehow angst, that are also motive forces in New York's painting. This one on the left, here's a print of his that reminds us that, as he said, he was moved most of all by Rembrandt. And of Rembrandt, he says, I see a human living presence and an energy that touches me. And it's that presence that keeps me painting. So like other artists of this period, he is certainly inspired by masterworks of the past. Now, Olvera died in 2010, but in 2014, Stanford opened the Windhover Center, which houses a series of works of Olvera's inspired by the hawks he saw gliding over the hills above Stanford. The series, here's one of them. The series is named after Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, The Windhover, which is about a dapple dawn-drawn falcon, if you remember that poem, and there's one of them. And I believe you can visit these works if you're there. Elmer Bischoff is also a local artist born in Berkeley, attended Berkeley, and returned from service in World War II, as many of these artists did, to find himself in the midst of the whirlwind at the Art Institute, where he was both an important teacher and worked as a full-time artist. So, of course, his early works were abstract like this one, but soon he moves into the figurative domain, and figure painting for him was the culmination of a search for more stimulation, more provocation. As David Park put it, he was also just looking for more trouble. There's a work called Girl in Orange Sweater from 1955 that I really like. And here's an interesting, non-figurative, actually, sort of figurative work of his, a landscape called Yellow Sky. And I have to say that I saw this in person for the first time a couple of years ago at SF MoMA. It's huge. It's a garage door size painting, and the colors just jump off the surface. I was so moved by it when I saw it. I'd only seen it small as a reproduction before that. Just to remind us that we should all actually look at these works in person when we are able to do so. Okay, so by the mid and later 50s, you know, a new vibe was happening in San Francisco. The figurative group, who had rebelled against the dominance of abstract expressionism, they were now the elder statespersons, the teachers, and the younger artists, as usual, absorbed what they had to say and then turned it on its head. Beatnik culture. And do you know that the term beatnik supposedly was coined by Herb Cain? It's beatnik, like Sputnik, because I guess they were both far out. So eventually the beatniks are going to give way to the hippies, which of course is going to have cultural influence even larger in San Francisco. The art of the late 50s going into the 60s, it was all over the place, and probably the best way to describe it is to call it early funk stuff. So all through this period, artists have been gathering in upstart galleries, clubs, and communal spaces, and the spirit of cross-fertilization was as strong as ever. Many of these artists combined media or worked in several different media. This King Ubu gallery here, we have a poster, was a former auto body shop on Fillmore Street. It was founded in 1952 by Jess Collins, a little more about him in a minute, and his partner Robert Duncan, the poet. A few years later, Wally Hedrick took it over, and it became the Six Gallery, which hosted what has been described as the most important poetry reading of the 20th century on October 7th, 1955, when Allen Ginsberg revealed to the world that the best minds of his generation were destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, and so forth, and so on and so forth in Howell. Among those associated with the Sixth Gallery and probably present at the reading of Howell, besides the poets and Jack Kerouac, who passed around a jug of wine, were Elmer Bischoff, Roy DeForest, Robert Duncan, Sonia Getjaw, Hassel Smith, Joan Brown, and Jay DeFeo. There they are at the Sixth, and a 19-year-old Leo Viador. So we'll find the second generation of the figurative movement at 2322 Fillmore Street, known as Painterland, home of two of the most innovative of this second wave of San Francisco artists, and that is Jay DeFeo and her husband, Wally Hedrick. So I want to look at the centerpiece of Jay's career, something that she worked and reworked, or as she said, constructed in paint, scraping down, building up for over 8 years, and that's the work of the Rose. So right away, on wavelength, the figurative crowd. This is a marriage of painting and sculpture. It's huge and it's crusty. It's 10 feet tall and almost 8 feet wide. At the thickest, at the bottom, the paint is 8 inches deep. Looks like a mattress when it's laid on its side. And it weighs over a ton. It took her several years to achieve. There are between 5 and 10 paintings, canvases piled on top of each other, scraped down and rebuilt using supposedly $5,000 worth of paint. So much paint is on it that in the early days it quivered as people approached it. Here it is, we can see it. That's true of many San Francisco paintings. They were very, very thick. They used very thick oil paint, and oil paint dries really, really slowly. Here it is. So the story goes that she didn't stop working on it until she and her husband were evicted from the apartment, at which point the Rose went to the Pasadena Museum where she worked a little more. Here's some really cool photographs taken by Bruce Connor of the work being removed from the apartment. It was too big to go out the window. And here, that's her up on the balcony, and her magnum opus is being treated by the expert art handlers at Beacons and then taken to Pasadena. It came back and was exhibited at SF MoMA, but it ended up being stored behind a wall in a conference room at the Art Institute, where it stayed for 25 years until after her death in 1989. The Whitney Museum in New York became interested in restoring it as part of a beat culture exhibit in 1995. So a couple of other works of hers, it's called Veronica, and this is Origin. And I'll show you again, look up close at these, that you can see these are done with a palette knife marks on there. And actually, so is this one, but the marks are different. So she uses them to do different things, but they're wonderful. And they have their source. Her inspiration is in nature. So feathers, grasses, trees, things like this. And generally her works either have some color in them or they have texture, but rarely both. So DeFeo and her husband, Wally Hedrick, found themselves right smack dab in the middle of the cultural upheaval of the times. And they didn't confine their revolt to their art making. They were politically active, and they delighted in revealing the dark, damp corners of 50s commercialism and prosperity. They were characters with a capital C. So here you can see Wally also at work in the apartment, and there to his right is the Rose, which was in a bay window so that the light came in from two sides on it. And in fact, when it was at SF MoMA a few years ago, there was a Jay DeFeo exhibit. That's how they placed it. They placed it in a niche and lighted it from the two sides, which is really unusual, but that's how it was when she worked on it. So here's a couple of works of Wally. So you can see we're kind of moving forward in time. Madame News Barbecue there. And Hermetic Image, which unfortunately for all of us has been destroyed. So Hedrick was a pioneer of assemblage or assemblage, junk art, and he had had the kind of irreverent take on art making that would turn up later on in the Davis funk artists of the 1970s. He used popular imagery, he used radios, TVs, flags, and so on, well before this was being done in New York by the pop artists. But because the San Francisco artists were so scornful of the art world, they really remained little known outside of San Francisco. At one point, Hedrick was employed by the Vesuvio Cafe in North Beach to make paintings while a jazz group played, and he apparently could make 5 or 6 a night. One of his students was this dude named Jerry Garcia. He studied with Hedrick and Elmer Bischoff at SFAI, and he credits Hedrick with turning him on to beat aesthetics and attitudes. So another interesting large construction of Hedrick's is his war room, which was 8 5x11 canvases, all painted black, facing inside, bolted together to create a freestanding room that could be entered, as you can see, by a small door, thus creating an architectural or environmental painting. It's interesting. Now, during this time, Hedrick was accused of stealing paintings, including a canvas by Clifford Still from the Art Institute where he was teaching, and either painting them black or painting over them with his own pictures. And I don't know if that's true. So another iconoclast, of course, is Bruce Conner, who produced an astonishing variety of works while at the Art Institute and hanging out on Fillmore Street. He's best known also for assemblages of women's nylon stockings. You can see in this one has nylons on it. Parts of furniture, broken dolls appear a lot, fur, costume jewelry, paint, photographs, and so forth. These works, most of them between 57 and 64, that kind of period, both old and new, they're art in a way and also in fashion, and they were just a supreme rejection of the optimistic consumerist spirit of mainstream American society. Here's another. Now, the East Coast pop artists like Rauschenberg and then Andy Warhol, they were ironic, but this goes way beyond irony into something else, actual disdain probably. He also made a lot of experimental assembled films, and many consider him one of the undiscovered masters of late 20th century art. And look a little bit at the work of Jess, a former participant in the Manhattan Project during the war, after the war, and the Hanford Atomic Energy Project in Washington State, who abandoned his career and his last name to come to San Francisco and devote himself to art. He studied at the Art Institute, and he began making collages and paintings using imagery from chemistry, which obviously he knew, alchemy, the occult, and male beauty. This is one of his paste-ups, he called them, this is a mouse's tail. And have a look at the imagery in here. So it's made of men from kind of muscle magazines and so forth. And he does other interesting things. One of a series called Translations. This one is called Far and Few. So clearly it's a painting based on a photograph, even on a signed photograph. It's interesting. These are oil paintings in a heavy kind of paint by numbers sort of style. And it's on canvas, but it includes a velvet covered wood frame around it. And each one of these had a text on the back. On the back of this one is Edward Lear's comic poem, The Jumblies, that goes, "Far and few," which is the title, far and few are the lands where the Jumblies live. Their heads are green, their hands are blue, and they went to sea in a sieve. And I think the Fab Four would probably like that. I think they were probably Jumbly fans themselves. And probably his most famous work is Narcissus, paste up. In other words, it's collage combined with graphite drawing of exquisite detail that took him almost 30 years to complete. And again, it's ginormous, garage door size, but turned the other way. It's got all sorts in it. There's Eros in the center with a bow and arrow and a figure of rejected love holding a crazy cat comic. It's just got all kinds of stuff going on in there. Most of the images actually come from other artists that he's copied or appropriated. It's a really interesting work. And finally, I want to look at the work of two artists, also residents in the Fillmore Street building, whose work revolves around presenting women in art. And that's the husband and wife team of Manuel Neri and then Joan Brown. So Neri is from a family of Mexican immigrant laborers. He actually went to Berkeley and was studying engineering when he just took a ceramics course for fun and totally changed his mind. He enrolled at the Art Institute, became overwhelmed by Still's ideas of what an artist really should be, and he decided to become a painter. And he ended up as one of the important founding instructors in the art department at UC Davis in the 1970s. So what he does, though, he started out as a painter, but he started working in plaster in the late 50s after seeing some similar works by Jay DeFeo. So plaster is an interesting material to work with. It dries very quickly, but you can hack it off and add more to it. So in a sense, he's doing something similar to Jay DeFeo as she constructed the rose with this kind of rough handling. And again, like Diebenkorn, these figures have no faces. So they're figures, but they're still abstractions. They're covered over with paint, kind of like an abstract expressionist canvas. And almost everything he did, later works he did in bronze and so forth, he didn't always work in plaster, but practically everything is of the female. And apparently he was inspired to this by the birth of his first child, which convinced him, as if anyone needed convincing, of the importance of the woman and the woman's fecundity. And finally, Joan Brown, a local girl who went to SFAI basically on a whim. She applied with a portfolio of sketches she had made of movie stars copied from fan magazines. And when she saw the work being done there, she was apparently really unimpressed, thought it was pointless. But by a year later, she was doing this. And you have to look at this for a minute to see what's going on.
Like a dog or a bear.
It's called Girl Bathing at Night. That's a girl in the center in the ocean. So it's got the figures, again, reduced to the barest possible information and this sludgy, really thick impasto paint, though it's got some bright colors going on in it. She was really interested in the deep, dark works of Rembrandt, Goya, Velasquez, like Bernice Bing was. And we can see her working with those influences, some of these early works, and you can see the incredible amount of paint that she's using and how she's applying it with all sorts of tools. Now, she got a lot of attention early on as a woman in what was still considered a man's world. In 1960, when she was 22, she had her first show in New York. She was the youngest person ever represented in what has become the Whitney Biennial, and she was even featured in Mademoiselle magazine. In 1962, her son, Noel, was born, and under guidance from her main mentor, Elmer Bischoff, she begins to focus on the world around her. And we see wonderful works like S.F. MoMA's Noel in the Kitchen. There he is over there with his droopy diaper. And the two family dogs, that's Bob the dog in there. I don't know if her kitchen actually is like this, but it looks like a kitchen mix. The very, very thick paint and bright, bright, bright colors that are typical for her. She occasionally modeled for Manuel Neri, her husband. And this is a work of hers, a diptych. It's in two pieces called, what's it called? In Manuel's studio or something like that. Again, with Bob the dog down at the bottom. She sometimes painted his figures, right? Dabbed paint on his plaster figures. But by the 60s, especially by the later 60s, times were changing again. And Joan Brown was no longer satisfied with these thick, dark works. So she gave up her New York gallery contract and devoted a year just to studying and refining her skills. And when she began to exhibit again, her style is radically different. And we feel, obviously, that we're entering another time, another place, another mood. So we have a woman wearing a mask on the left, and on the right, another, I changed that, another mask figure, cat. So she moves from working with oil on canvas to working with enamel paints on masonite. And so the images are flat and they're brittle. So she's not just working with color, she's using drawing skills as well. And drawing becomes important, creating really representational images, although many of them are fantastic, in two-dimensional space, right, or three-dimensional space. Images from dreams, from mythology, her study of mythology, and from interests of hers in life, such as swimming to Alcatraz, which she did, animals, and so forth. These are interesting works of hers. So as we can see, something has definitely changed. And this is basically where we're going to end, as the San Francisco art scene is eclipsed, for a while anyway, by a surprising new wave emanating from the east. I mean, just a little way east and slightly north. As the 70s dawn, there's a big ball going on in Cowtown. And by Cowtown, I mean the newly formed art department at UC Davis, where we're going to see a whole lot of other and different works coming to the fore and taking over. So, but that's a story for another day. So thank you so much for listening to this, and I'll see if anyone